Welcome back to another episode of DR650 Garage Mechanic. Today we're going to be looking at the BST Carb and squeezing out a little bit more power. To get this job done, you're going to need a JIS screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, an 8, 10, 12 millimeter socket, along with a 10 millimeter wrench, a set of pliers, a ProCycle jet kit, a power drill with a 1/8 inch bit, and a saw or a cutoff wheel. The goal today is to take the carb out of the bike, install the jet kit, and put the carb back on the bike. Now all of this work is possible to do without taking the carb out of the bike, but it makes it a little bit more difficult. I'm going to start by using a Phillips head screwdriver to remove the left hand side and the right hand side panels. Once I've removed the side panels, I have access to the two 12 millimeter bolts that are holding on the seat to the frame. Once you remove both of the bolts, you can simply slide the seat back and lift it straight up off the frame. Because I'm still using a vacuum operated petcock, I need to make sure that it's set to on so no fuel comes out when I undo the hose. With a flathead screwdriver, I'm going to undo the hose clamp and simply slide it off of the petcock. I need to do the same with the vacuum hose on the back side of the petcock. With the fuel line disconnected, I'm ready to take the tank off. I need to use the 10 millimeter socket and undo the two bolts at the base of the tank. On the California models, there's an evap hose hanging on the right hand side of the tank. I need to use a pair of pliers to reach up and pry that off. To remove the tank, we're simply going to slide it back and lift it straight up off the frame. With the tank removed, we now have access to the two 10 millimeter nuts that are holding the throttle cables onto the carb body. We can use the 10 millimeter wrench to loosen the top nut and slide the throttle cables out of their position. We can now see two hose clamps holding on the front and back side of the carb. We need to use a screwdriver to loosen both of the hose clamps so we can eventually slide the carb body out from the bike. On my bike, I have a remote choke installed, so I need to loosen the 8 millimeter bolt that's holding that to the engine. Finally, there are two hoses located on the right hand side of the carb that need to be removed in order for us to take the carb out of the bike. With a little bit of effort and a couple bloody knuckles, eventually you should have something that looks like this on your workbench. To get started on this magic trick, we're going to flip this carb upside down after draining all of the gas out of the bowl. Locate the two bolts that are holding the bowl onto the body of the carb. I've already replaced mine with hex head bolts. We need to remove these in order to gain access to the jets. Use a flathead screwdriver to slowly back out the main jet that you see in the center of the screen. It should have a stamped size on the top of it. Now with the modifications I've already made to my bike, I decided to use the 150 main jet that came with the kit. Be careful not to damage the brass spacer that sits between the jet and the carb body. Add your new jet by simply screwing it back into the place where the old jet was. Make sure to retain the brass spacer. Here you can see a picture of the 150 main jet installed back in the carb. Now that we're done installing the jet, we need to put the carb bowl back on and screw the two bolts that hold the bowl back onto the body. Now because they are prone to stripping, it's much easier at this point to replace the old JIS screws with new hex head bolts. Next, we're going to work on the top side of the carb, which includes the diaphragm, the spring, and the needle. First, we're going to loosen the two JIS screws that sit on the top of the diaphragm. Next, we'll pull the cover straight off to expose the spring. Remove the spring by pulling it straight up. Then, we need to grab on to the black diaphragm and pull it straight up as well. This should leave us with a fully intact diaphragm that has the needle still attached. With the slide out of the carb, it's now a great opportunity to clean and inspect the inside of the carb. With the top side of the carb disassembled, we're now ready to start reassembling. Here we can see a side-by-side comparison of the stock needle on the right and the new tapered needle that comes in the ProCycle jet kit on the left. For the settings on my bike, what seems to work best is to have the clip positioned on the fourth slot down from the top. The position of your clip will depend on the settings on your bike, which would include upgraded exhaust, open airbox, and the altitude at which you ride. Next, we're going to clip the spring to increase the throttle response. We need to clip off the top two rings. You can see here on the right hand side a modified spring and on the left hand side the stock spring. Count down two rings and use a pair of pliers to make the clip. After we've modified the spring, it's time to drill the slide in the carb. In this photo, we see a side-by-side comparison of an unmodified and a modified slide. For this part of the modification, we're only interested in drilling a third hole for this slide. We don't want to modify or touch anything related to the center hole. That center hole is used to hold the needle in place. Now, using a power drill and a 1/8 inch bit, we want to enlarge the hole on the left hand side and drill a hole on the right hand side that matches it equally. After we've finished drilling the hole, we want to end up with a slide that looks exactly like the version shown at the top of this photo. With the hole drilled, we're ready to clean everything up and start reassembling the top end of the carb. To begin reassembling the top end of the carb, we need to insert the needle directly into the center hole of the slide. Now we can put the slide back into the carb and align the needle with the open hole at the base of the carb. By doing this, we can make sure that the needle isn't going to bind when it's in motion. With the slide and diaphragm seated properly, we can now install the spring in the top end of the carb. With the spring in place, we're now ready to put the lid back on the diaphragm of the carb. We're going to use the JIS screwdriver to remount the screws to hold the lid in place. The final adjustment I want to make on this carb is to install a thumb screw to control the air-fuel mixture. Lucky for me, the plug on my carb was already drilled out from the previous owner. You may have to use the drill bit that comes with the ProCycle Jet Kit to drill out the plug to be able to install the thumb screw. The advantage of having this thumb screw is you can lean out or richen up the mixture on the fly with the bike running. The setting that seems to work best for my bike is to have this air-fuel screw turned out 3 complete turns. With the 150 main jet, a modified airbox, and an aftermarket exhaust seems to be the perfect mix for my bike. With the entire carb reassembled, it's time to begin installing it back into the bike. The first part is going to require the most effort. It's going to require you to wiggle, twist, turn, push, pull, grunt, swear, bleed, maybe even cry to get it back into the airbox. Once you have the carb back in the bike, the install from this point is fairly straightforward. We need to tighten the hose clamps at the front and back side of the carb and reinstall the 2 hoses that were attached on the right hand side of the carb that we removed earlier. At this point, we can begin reinstalling the throttle cables back into their original housing. Now we can reinstall the tank by setting it over the frame and sliding it onto the rubber holders. Next, we'll take the 10mm socket and tighten the 2 bolts that are holding the tank to the frame. Next, we'll use a pair of pliers to put the fuel hose back onto the petcock, and then use a flathead screwdriver to redo the hose clamp to hold it in place. With the tank and the fuel hose back in place, we're now ready to move on to airbox modification. You have 2 options when you're modifying the airbox. Some people opt to make a 2-inch hole on the top side of the airbox, while others opt to drill small holes in the airbox door. Unfortunately for me, the previous owner already made the decision. When you jet the carb, you're going to have to open up the airbox in one of these 2 methods. If you decide to use the 2-inch hole at the top side of the airbox, make sure that your secondary breather hose is out of the way. The last thing I need to do before I fire it up and go for a test ride is to reinstall the remote choke on the engine case. Here we can see the final product with the new tank, new petcock, and the fully jetted carb reinstalled back in the bike. I will have to address the weird bend in the fuel line before I take it on any longer trips. Now I can reinstall the seat back onto the frame. We need to use 2 12mm bolts to secure the seat back to the frame. Finally, we reinstall the side covers and we're ready to fire it up. Again, depending on altitude, airbox modifications, and exhaust modifications, the settings on your carb may vary from the ones that I've described here. But this tutorial should show you just how easy it is to make modifications to your own BST carb. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of DR650 Garage Mechanic.